My name is Mac Hereford. This is for the Honors Lincoln class. This is at Woodbury Forest School. Today we talk about the tension between the fate Lincoln could not control and the future he sought to shape. The sectional crisis and Civil War meant a lot to Lincoln. And the most important thing to him about the whole crisis was originally the preservation of the Union. But over time, this idea changed.
Lincoln learned things throughout the war and had many new ideas come to thought. His ability to adapt and change with the circumstances he was given proved to be very effective and made him the great leader he was. His language changed over time, showing the shifting tension between a fate he could not control and a future he sought to shape. We can see this change in language through his use of connectors to the people, his ideas on the issue of slavery, his goal to preserve the Union, and his view of God and what the American people would do to impact the world. The first thing to look over is Lincoln's connector to the people. Lincoln finds it very important to connect the people together with a common cause or idea. Lincoln originally used the Declaration to do this. He used the Declaration and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he said that slavery criticizes the Declaration of Independence. He then went on to talk about how the Declaration is our ancient faith, and how its power was made by people like us. He does this to connect the people with the Declaration and the people who wrote it, so he can use this to attack the issue of slavery. He again spoke of the Declaration in a speech on the Dred Scott decision, where he said the Declaration has been mangled and ruined, and that the Declaration was once glorious. He continued with the use of the old document in a speech at Chicago, Illinois, where he talked about the people and said if they look back through history to place their connection with those days, they can feel they are part when they look through the old Declaration of Independence. The Declaration to Lincoln was an electric cord that links hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together. Lincoln uses this document thinking that it is the best way to help solve the issue of slavery and in turn preserve the Union. We get to see Lincoln's language change with the use of his connector as he moves from the Declaration to the Constitution. He knew he could not control the people and their thoughts, and he started to understand that to them, the use of the Declaration was too radical. He needed to adjust, and he did. The people were something he could not necessarily control, but at the same time he knew he could connect them somehow to be able to form a future he sought. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln spoke of the Constitution, saying that all protection and laws set consistently with the Constitution can be given and will be cheerfully given to all the states when lawfully demanded. He does this because he believes the Constitution can be interpreted and makes it clear that if someone were to make a point that is justified by the Constitution, he shall give the person freedom of a law or put a law in place. The Constitution allowed Lincoln to be more flexible than he had been with the Declaration. Later on, these two things, the Declaration and the Constitution, matter, but is not what Lincoln uses as much as he does the fate of the country and even the world. He realizes what happens in the U.S. will affect other countries as well as the country itself. He connects people to a cause of the future that they have the ability to change. In the first inaugural address, he said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine." He realizes the fate relies with the people, but he can try his best to lead them in the right direction and bring them into a future he can see. The next thing that relates heavily to his use of connectors is the issue of slavery. Lincoln did not like slavery from the beginning. He even said early on that it has made us grow fat and that we have become so greedy to become masters that we make the self-evident truth of all men are created equal a self-evident lie. He thinks this, but he also is conflicted because he does not get rid of slavery yet. He actually claims that he wishes to make and keep the distinction between the existing institution and the extension of it, so broad and so clear that no honest man can misunderstand him. This again shows that Lincoln struggles with what he could not control and the future he wanted to make. He wanted to get rid of slavery, but at the same time he could not do it, or he so believed. Lincoln still struggles to find the meaning in slavery and what he should do with the issue. He ends up in the middle of the crisis, blaming the slaves for the whole thing. In his address on colonization, he said to the African Americans that our race suffers from their presence. Later on, Lincoln's ideas become more fixed as he starts to understand the war better. He realizes eventually that it is not the slaves to blame, but the institution of slavery itself. And he realized this because he said that God opposes things and that American slavery is one of those offenses that God now wills to remove. Lincoln started to actually care about the fate of the slaves themselves. We can see this especially in his letter to Horace Greeley. Lincoln starts to sort things out, and the battle between this fate and future he wanted to shape becomes clear because of his understanding of God. Lincoln realized through the war and the crisis of separation that everything is not about using the Declaration or Constitution to get rid of slavery, but using those pieces of our past to help the people understand the deeper meaning to the situation at hand. Lincoln's idea of God and his work goes hand in hand with this eternal battle he has. Lincoln originally was confused with the will of God. He had not truly understood what side God was on. Near the rear of his lifetime, he started to understand this, and the deeper meaning that Andrew Delbanco writes about in Lincoln's Sacramento language starts to come clear. Lincoln understood the Almighty has his own purposes, and that God meant for the people to be equal. Lincoln also mentions the fact that the war was not necessarily the fault of just the North or South. Both parties deprecated war. He mentions that the North also benefited from slavery, not only the South, but it is now time to get rid of the institution. His idea of the South being the ones at fault changes over time, and he begins to no longer believe it is solely theirs. All of these things that Lincoln had dealt with over time had a big impact on his main idea, in which was to preserve the Union. Lincoln originally said he will do anything that is necessary to preserve the Union. He fought against slavery, thinking it was bad for the Union, and fought against many other things as well. He realized, though, late in his internal struggles, that everything that has happened is so much bigger than he would have ever imagined. We can see everything comes together for Lincoln when he spoke a meaningful speech at the Gettysburg Address. He said that what is said at the address does not matter as much as what the people who fought there died for. Lincoln mentioned that we can never forget what they did there. We then see this understanding of the future he sought to control and how he puts that into place. He says to the people that there's a great task remaining before us. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Lincoln finally connected the fate he could not control, the future he sought to shape. He brought the two together and brought the idea of equality for all to our nation. And in doing so, the cause to the world in him was bigger than a war or issue of slavery, but a new birth of an idea that would shape the world for years to come. He would start this birth by binding up the nation's wounds and reconstructing the United States. Abraham Lincoln was an incredible leader who was able to search for something deeper in what was going on in the nation. He eventually found something that had to do with more than the nation itself, but the world. He was, in short, a believer. His faith was in the transcendent principle of human equality. He had the ability to communicate his faith of his documents as America's scripture. These things helped Lincoln with his struggles to form the nation he wanted to form, and at the same time realized the things he could not change. Abraham Lincoln was a courageous man who had a purpose he believed God wanted him to fulfill, and he did. And by doing so, he gave way to the world we know. I would like to leave viewers with a quote. I will prepare, and someday my chance will come.
Thank you, Dr. Holsey. Thank you, Woodbury Forest School. And finally, thank you, Andrew Delbanco, for your book, The Portable Abraham Lincoln.